She walked out of the garage that morning with the same quiet determination that had carried her through countless battles against doubt, resistance, and the expectations of others. The sun was just starting to rise above the industrial district of Detroit, and the early autumn chill nipped at her jacket. For years she had been underestimated, brushed off as a mechanic who didn't belong in the world of exotic cars. But today was different. Today she was about to face the biggest test of her career, the one that might change her entire future and silence every voice that had doubted her. The McLaren sat in the middle of the garage like a wounded beast, gleaming in metallic silver but hiding scars beneath the hood that had stumped some of the sharpest minds in automotive engineering. The company's own team of engineers had declared it beyond saving, a failure of design that simply wasn't worth the endless hours already poured into it. The vehicle had been shipped across the country, passed from one specialist to another, until finally it ended up here, in this modest garage that seemed almost too humble for such a machine. And yet, it was here she stood, ready to give it one more chance. Her name was Samantha Hayes, though everyone in the neighborhood simply called her Sam. She had grown up in a small Michigan town where her father ran a repair shop that smelled constantly of oil, rubber, and steel. From the time she was old enough to hold a wrench, she had been immersed in the rhythms of mechanical life. When other kids were playing video games, she was learning how to rebuild carburetors and fix broken transmissions. She wasn't supposed to be the one to inherit that world, not according to her relatives who assumed her brothers would take over. But while they drifted toward other pursuits, Sam had stayed in the shop, listening to the music of engines and falling in love with the language of machines. That passion carried her into adulthood, but it also carried a heavy cost. The automotive industry, especially the high-performance sector, had little space for someone like her. She had applied to countless positions with major manufacturers, from Ford to General Motors, only to be dismissed politely or ignored entirely. Even when she did land interviews, her gender seemed to overshadow her talent. The looks she received in those boardrooms told her everything. She wasn't what they expected, and certainly not what they believed they needed. So Sam carved her own path, working independently, building a reputation not with flashy advertisements, but with the quiet success of solving problems no one else could. It was that reputation that brought the McLaren to her garage. A wealthy collector from Chicago had reached out in desperation, explaining that the car had been sitting idle for nearly a year. Every attempt to fix it had failed. The engine shut down unpredictably. The transmission lagged under acceleration, and the electrical systems behaved as if possessed by ghosts. The engineers had blamed design flaws, the collectors whispered about curses, and yet all agreed it was beyond saving. All, that is, except Sam. She saw the challenge not as a dead end, but as a puzzle that demanded to be solved. Standing before the machine now, she laid her hand gently on its hood, as though greeting a patient in need of surgery. She didn't see just an expensive car. She saw years of engineering compressed into steel, carbon fiber, and innovation. She respected it, but she did not fear it. Fear, after all, had no place in the garage. She rolled up her sleeves, tied back her hair, and began the long process of disassembling what others had abandoned. Piece by piece, she listened to the story the car was telling her, every nut and bolt revealing a clue the engineers had missed. The first hours were spent combing through the basics, checking systems that should have worked but somehow failed under stress. She noticed the wiring harness had been replaced multiple times, each attempt leaving subtle mistakes behind. She traced the path of current like a detective following footprints in the snow, finding where resistance built up in ways no one had considered. It wasn't a simple electrical short, it was a chain reaction triggered by a sensor deep within the drivetrain. Where others had seen a mess, Sam saw a map. She took notes meticulously, filling her notebook with sketches and calculations, her hands blackened with grease and graphite. As the hours turned into days, she became consumed by the project. The world outside faded, the chatter of neighbors, the buzz of phones, the noise of traffic. Her life narrowed into the hum of the garage, the smell of gasoline, the rattle of tools on metal. Every night she left exhausted. Every morning she returned with renewed determination. She wasn't just fixing a car. She was fighting to prove that persistence could outlast doubt, that one mechanic in a forgotten corner of Detroit could succeed where corporate teams had failed. And deep inside, she knew this wasn't just about engineering, it was about respect. On the fourth night, something remarkable happened. She had been wrestling with the transmission issue, tracing the software patterns that dictated its shifting logic. The engineers had relied too heavily on automated testing, trusting the algorithms to adapt. But Sam trusted her intuition. She reprogrammed the control unit manually, line by line, rewriting code as though she were composing music. At dawn, she fired up the McLaren, listening carefully as the engine roared to life. This time, the gears shifted cleanly, the hesitation gone. She smiled faintly, knowing she had just solved the part everyone else had abandoned. But this was only half the battle. There was still the problem of stability at high speeds, the mysterious shutdowns that left the car powerless without warning. Sam understood that fixing this required more than mechanical skill, it required courage. Most mechanics would never dare to test a McLaren on the open road, especially one so unstable, but she had no choice. That evening, after checking her work, she slid into the driver's seat. The leather was soft beneath her fingers, the cockpit like that of a jet fighter. She turned the key, and once more the engine roared. As she pulled onto the empty highway, her heart pounded not from fear, but from exhilaration. The car surged forward, faster and more alive than it had been in months. Every shift was smooth, every turn precise. Yet as the speedometer climbed past 120, the familiar shutdown struck. The engine sputtered, warning lights flashed, and the car lost power. Sam guided it safely to the shoulder, her jaw tightening in frustration. But she wasn't discouraged. She had seen it, felt it, and now she understood. The shutdown wasn't random. It was triggered by a sequence of overheating sensors linked to a miscalibrated cooling system. The engineers had been chasing software when the problem was rooted in physics. She returned to the garage with renewed focus. Hours turned into days again as she stripped the cooling system, rebuilding it with precision adjustments and custom modifications. She fabricated parts by hand, machining components in ways the original engineers hadn't dared. When friends stopped by to check on her, she barely looked up, consumed by her vision. She wasn't merely repairing a supercar. She was rewriting the story of failure into one of triumph. And in that process, she was proving that brilliance wasn't confined to university labs or corporate offices. It could exist in a small Detroit garage, carried by someone who simply refused to give up. By the end of the second week, she was ready. The car gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its engine purring with a confidence it hadn't known in years. Sam wiped her hands on a rag, staring at it with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. Tomorrow she would test it again, pushing it harder than ever before. But tonight she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She thought about her father, who had always believed in her even when the world did not. She thought about the years of rejection, the doubters, the engineers who had dismissed her, and she thought about what it would mean if she succeeded. That night she barely slept, her mind running faster than any engine. At dawn she returned, slid behind the wheel, and drove out once more. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility, the morning air crisp against her skin. She pressed the accelerator, and the McLaren leapt forward, smooth and flawless. 100 miles an hour, then 120, then 150. The car did not falter. The shutdown never came. For the first time in nearly a year, the machine was whole again. Sam laughed, a sound carried away by the wind, her triumph echoing down the empty road. She pulled back into the garage an hour later, heart still pounding, tears threatening her eyes. She had done it. Against all odds, she had restored what others abandoned. She didn't know what the future would hold, whether the world would finally take notice, whether the industry would finally open its doors. But she knew this. She had proven to herself that no obstacle was too great, no problem too unsolvable. And that belief was worth more than any recognition. As she stepped out of the McLaren, the garage bathed in morning light. Sam Hayes knew her life had changed forever.